Well now, are you settled? If so, then let's do our little trick. Let your eyes soften. Don't close them, just keep them distant, as if the room has decided to leave you alone for a while. And you'll find that the longer you try to stay awake, the sooner sleep will come. Let your jaw ease without effort. Let your breathing slow until it barely feels like something you're doing. Let the bed take over the job of holding you. And if you hear something gently testing the handle of the door, don't respond. It only tries once. Now, let's begin tonight's stories. The sound carried first. It came across the bog like a low wind finding a crack in a wall. It wasn't loud, it was steady. It was the kind of crying that didn't ask for comfort. A cottage sat alone beyond the turf stacks. A single lamp burned behind the glass. Inside, someone moved past a window and disappeared again. And out there, in the mist, the crying went on. Chrissy and Callum were meant to be home before the light went. That was the rule. That was always the rule. They had broken it in the small, ordinary way children break rules. They hadn't decided to break it. They decided to do one more thing first. Just one more thing was Callum's favorite sentence. Chrissy walked ahead, arms folded, trying to look like a person who didn't care that the dusk was falling. Callum walked behind, dragging a stick through the ditch and making a click off stones like a marching band. "If Mam asks," Callum said, "we were delayed." "We weren't delayed," Chrissy said. "You were poking dead frogs with a stick." "They weren't dead," Callum replied. "They were resting." Chrissy stopped and turned. She looked at him the way only an older sibling can look at you, like you've disappointed them in a way that's almost impressive. "Resting?" she repeated. "Aye," Callum said, nodding seriously. "You know, with their eyes open." Chrissy sighed and started walking again. The road was narrow and uneven, hedges on both sides. Beyond the hedge on the left, the bog opened out, dark pools of water reflecting the last grey of the sky. There was a smell of someone's fire hanging in the distance. Callum speed-walked to catch up. "Do you think we're in trouble?" he asked. "Yes," Chrissy said. "How much trouble?" "A lot." Callum took this in for a moment. "Could we run the last bit, do you think?" he said, hopeful. Chrissy kept walking. "Running makes it look worse. And that's not true." "It is true," Chrissy said. "If you run, you look guilty." Callum was confused. "But we are guilty." Chrissy glanced at him. "That's why we don't need to advertise it." Callum looked ahead at the road, then down at the bog again. "Why is the bog always there?" he asked, as if it was new. Chrissy didn't even turn. "Because it doesn't get up and move, Callum." "I know that," he said quickly. "I mean, it's always watching, like it's waiting for someone to fall in." Chrissy slowed down. She didn't like how the sky had changed. Twilight in the countryside could shift fast. 1 minute, you still had color. The next minute, everything was just shapes. "Stop talking, will you?" she said. "You're making it worse." "I'm not making anything worse," Callum muttered. "I'm just noticing things." Chrissy walked a bit faster, and that's when they heard it. At first, it sounded like a dog. It wasn't barking, not a normal sound, more like a long, thin whine that rose and fell. Chrissy slowed further. Callum stopped dragging his stick. They listened. The sound came again. This was no dog. It was crying. Not the sort of crying you'd hear from a child who fell over. Not even the crying of someone in a row. It was older than that. It came from out beyond the hedge toward the bog, low and continuous, as if whoever was doing it hadn't taken a full breath in a very long time. Callum leaned closer to Chrissy. "Is that Mrs. Flanagan?" he whispered. Chrissy looked at him as if he had asked whether the moon was their aunt. "Why would it be Mrs. Flanagan?" "Because she cries," Callum said. "She cries about everything." Chrissy opened her mouth to scold him, then stopped, because the crying moved. It moved closer, like someone walking slowly along the bog edge. Chrissy felt goosebumps crawl across her skin. "Come on," she said quietly, and started walking again. Callum didn't move. "Chrissy," he said, voice dropping, "we can't just leave her." Chrissy stopped again, irritated now because irritation was easier than fear. "We don't even know who it is," she said. "It's a person," Callum said. "You can tell." Chrissy scowled. "And what are we meant to do? Rescue her from crying, is it?" Callum glanced towards the hedge. The crying had a kind of wet edge to it, close enough that she could hear the breath between sobs. "It's not normal crying," he said. Chrissy didn't like that he was right. She stepped toward the hedge and pushed through a gap where branches had been broken back by cattle. Callum followed, staying close. On the other side was rough ground leading out toward the bog, tufts of grass, soft earth, pools of black water. A thin layer of mist sat low and moved slowly like smoke with nowhere to go. And there, standing near a patch of rushes, was a woman. She wore a long grey dress that looked too light for the cold. Her hair hung down in dark strands. Her shoulders rose and fell with that steady, endless sobbing. Chrissy went absolutely still, and Callum whispered, "Oh." The woman didn't look at them. She didn't even seem to notice they'd arrived. Chrissy took one step forward. Miss," she called carefully. The woman's head turned slightly, not fully, just enough that Chrissy saw her face in profile. Pale, too pale for the evening light. Eyes downcast, mouth open in a sound that wasn't a word. Callum shuffled his feet. Chrissy felt her stomach dip, but she held her voice steady. Are you lost?" Chrissy asked. The crying didn't stop. It just continued, as if it was happening through her rather than from her. Callum leaned toward Chrissy and whispered, Maybe she can't hear us." Chrissy whispered back, "Stop whispering, she can hear us." Callum's eyes widened. "How do you know?" Chrissy didn't answer. She didn't know. She just wanted to sound like she did. She tried again. "Do you need help, dear?" Chrissy asked. The woman's crying faltered for a moment, just a slight catch. Then it resumed. Callum took a brave step forward because Callum always did that at the worst times. "Do you want us to get someone?" he asked, like a grown-up. Chrissy grabbed his sleeve and tugged him back. The woman lifted her head a fraction, and for the first time her eyes moved properly, not to their faces, past them, as if she was looking for something behind them on the road. "Callum," Chrissy said under her breath, "we're going home." Callum shook his head, stubborn. Oh, we can. She's what? Callum looked at the woman and struggled to find the word without saying it. She's weird, he said. Chrissy didn't like that either. The woman's sobbing softened again, like she was coming to the end of a long weep. Her lips moved. No sound came. Then, very quietly, she spoke just one word. O'Neill. It landed in the air like a small stone dropping into still water. Chrissy stared. Callum stared. The woman's mouth opened again. Her eyes drifted past them once more. O'Neill, she said again, barely above her breath. Callum blinked. What? Chrissy's mind raced through the names she knew, families, neighbours, the ones her mother spoke about in a certain tone. Then it hit her. Mrs. O'Neill, down beyond the bog. The woman who kept hens and had a little whitewashed cottage where the roof dipped. The woman whose husband had coughed for weeks and hadn't been seen in town lately. Callum whispered. Chrissy? Chrissy didn't take her eyes off the crying woman. I know, she whispered back. Callum said nervously. Is she looking for Mrs. O'Neill? Chrissy didn't want to say yes because saying yes made it real, but the crying woman had said it like it was an address. O'Neill. Callum glanced back toward the road, then toward the misty stretch of bog. That's pretty far, he whispered. Chrissy's voice came out small. Not far. Callum gave her a look. It is far when Mam's waiting with a wooden spoon. Chrissy glared at him. Stop thinking about that spoon. Callum looked back at the woman. She's just standing there, he whispered. Is she going to follow us, I wonder? As if answering him, the woman took one slow step forward. Her bare foot pressed into the soft ground without a sound. Chrissy felt her throat trying to crawl up into her mouth. She's coming, Callum said, half amazed. Chrissy forced herself to breathe. This was stupid. This was dangerous. This was none of their business. And still, leaving her there felt worse. Chrissy stepped back through the hedge gap toward the road. Okay, she said, loud enough to sound sure. Okay, we'll bring you. Callum shot her a look. We will? Chrissy hissed. Yes, Callum, we will. And you'll keep your mouth shut, you clown. Callum nodded immediately like he had been waiting for permission to be terrified. They stepped onto the road. The woman followed. Not close behind, not far away, just there. Always a few paces back, crying softly as she walked. Callum kept glancing over his shoulder, his face pinched. She's not even walking right. Look at her, he whispered. Chrissy glanced too. The woman's steps were slow, even, careful. Her dress didn't sway the way cloth should. Her hair hung heavy, as if wet, though no rain fell. Callum leaned in again. Chrissy, she's not blinking. Chrissy snapped. Will you stop staring at her? They walked. The road curved. Mist slipped over the low ground and drifted across the stones. The hedges became darker shapes. The last light sat behind clouds, leaving the world in a dull, cold wash. Callum tried to distract himself because he couldn't help himself. Maybe she's just sad, he whispered. Chrissy replied without looking at him. Callum, she's walking around the bog in her bare feet, crying and saying one surname. Some people are just like that, Callum said. Chrissy actually turned her head to that. What are you on about, Callum? Who? Callum paused. Mrs. Flanagan. Chrissy let out a short breath that was almost a laugh, then stopped herself because the crying behind them had changed. It had moved into a different kind of sound, like it had found the right direction. Chrissy glanced back. The woman's head was lifted slightly, eyes forward. She wasn't wandering anymore. She was going somewhere. Callum noticed too. His voice dropped. She knows. Chrissy wasn't sure what to say to that. They reached the point where the road dipped toward the bog crossing. A narrow timber footbridge sat over dark water. Callum stopped dead. No, he said. Chrissy turned. What? That bridge is rotten, Callum said. You'll go straight through it. Chrissy rolled her eyes. So we crossed it last week, and it squeaked, Callum insisted. Chrissy looked at the woman behind them. She had stopped as well, just a few paces back, crying softly again, as if waiting for them to decide. Chrissy felt a strange pressure in her chest, like they were holding up something by standing still. Come on, she said, and stepped onto the bridge. The boards held. They squeaked, yes, but they held. Callum followed, quick steps, as if speed could make him lighter. The woman stepped onto the bridge at last, and the bridge did not squeak under her, not once. Callum's eyes went huge. Chrissy's hands clenched, but she kept walking. Once over, the path narrowed. On one side was bog. On the other side was a field with low stone walls and patches of gorse. In the distance, a small cottage sat with a single window lit. Callum whispered, That's it. Chrissy nodded. Yep, that's it. They walked toward it. Halfway there, Callum said, very quietly, Chrissy, what? If we bring her there, he whispered, and if she's, you know, Chrissy kept her eyes on the cottage. Say it. Callum swallowed. If she's what people say she is, then someone's probably going to die. Chrissy stopped walking. The crying woman stopped too. The sound of the bog sat all around them. A bird called once and fell quiet again. Chrissy turned on Callum, low and fierce. We don't know that, she whispered. Callum's face crumpled slightly, the brave act slipping. But she said O'Neill. Chrissy's voice softened, just a bit. Mrs. O'Neill's husband is sick, but people get sick and people get better too. Callum nodded quickly, grateful for that possibility. Then the woman behind them spoke again. O'Neill. Only once, but this time it sounded satisfied. Chrissy gulped. Callum's eyes filled slightly and he blinked hard, like he could blink it away. Chrissy forced herself to walk again. Just keep going, she said. Callum followed. The cottage grew larger. The light in the window flickered, then steadied. Smoke rose from the chimney in a thin line. As they reached the gate, the crying woman's sobbing quieted, just turning into a low hum of grief. Chrissy opened the gate and it creaked. Callum whispered, We shouldn't go in. Chrissy whispered back, We're not going to go in. They stepped up the short path to the door. Chrissy raised her hand to knock. Then she hesitated, listening. No voices, no music, no movement. Callum stood very still, staring at the door as if it might open by itself. The woman behind them had stopped crying completely. Chrissy glanced back. The woman stood at the edge of the path, head tilted slightly toward the cottage, as if listening to something inside that the children couldn't hear. Callum whispered, Why did she stop? Chrissy didn't reply. She knocked. The sound was loud in the quiet evening. One knock, then another, then footsteps inside, slow and heavy. The door opened just a tad. Mrs. O'Neill appeared, face lined, hair pinned back. She looked at the children first, confused. "Chrissy? Callum?" she said softly. "What are you doing out here at this hour?" Chrissy's mouth opened. Nothing came out. Because behind Mrs. O'Neill, in the dim light of the cottage, a man sat slumped in a chair by the hearth, his head tilted in a way that made Chrissy's stomach drop. Mrs. O'Neill followed Chrissy's stare and turned quickly. "Me Hall?" she said, voice catching. She stepped back into the cottage, moving fast now, fear in her shoulders. Callum gripped Chrissy's sleeve hard. Chrissy's breath came shallow. Behind them, the crying began again. This was keening, a long rising wail that climbed up the air and made the hair on the back of Chrissy's neck lift. Mrs. O'Neill let out a sound, half gasp, half sob, and disappeared inside toward the chair. Chrissy stood frozen on the step. Callum whispered, "Chrissy?" She couldn't move. The keening went on, filling the small yard, rolling out across the bog like a warning bell. Then it stopped, just like that. The silence after it felt heavier than the sound. Chrissy turned slowly. The yard was empty. The crying woman was nowhere to be seen. No footsteps, no rustle in the grass, no shape drifting away in mist. Only the gate creaking slightly in the breeze. Callum's voice was small. Where did she go?" "I don't know," Chrissy whispered. From inside the cottage, Mrs. O'Neill cried out, a sound that needed an answer and wouldn't get one. Chrissy grabbed Callum's hand and pulled him back down the path. Callum stumbled, looking over his shoulder. "We did that," he whispered. Chrissy stopped at the gate and looked at him sharply. "No," she said, voice trembling. "We didn't do anything." Callum's face twisted. "Sure didn't we bring her here?" Chrissy's eyes filled and she blinked fast. "We brought a crying woman to a house, Callum," she whispered. "That's all. We didn't hurt anyone." Callum nodded, but he didn't look convinced. They slipped out onto the road again and began walking home, fast. Callum tried to talk because silence scared him more. "Maybe," he whispered, "maybe she was going there anyway." Chrissy didn't respond. Callum kept going. "Maybe she didn't need us at all." Chrissy's grip on his hand tightened. They walked, breath puffing faint in the cold air. Halfway back, Callum said, "Chrissy?" "What?" "If we see another crying woman," he said carefully, "we're not helping her, okay?" Chrissy almost laughed. Then she almost cried. "Agreed," she whispered. Callum nodded, then added, "Unless, she looks normal and not all weird." Chrissy looked at him. Callum defended himself quickly. "Some women cry normal, I mean." Chrissy shook her head. "Callum, if she's crying on the bog and saying surnames, she's not normal." Callum nodded solemnly. "Right, no surnames." They reached the footbridge again. This time, both of them crossed quickly. On the far side, the road climbed slightly toward home. The cottage lights were faint in the distance. Callum looked back once because he couldn't help himself. The mist sat over the bog, dark and quiet, and then he stopped walking. Chrissy felt it through his hand. "What?" she snapped, voice thin. Callum pointed with his free hand, trembling. Across the bog, far off, where the ruin of an old stone wall broke the horizon, a pale shape stood for a moment, just a moment, a woman's outline, still as a post, and then the mist shifted, and she wasn't there. Callum whispered, "She's following us back, is she?" Chrissy stared. She saw nothing now, but her skin crawled anyway. "Keep walking," she said. Callum obeyed, because for once he had no clever answer. They walked home under a sky that had gone fully dark, and behind them, over the bog, the air stayed quiet, as if it was listening. In the countryside, children hear things early. They hear what grown people say when they think no one is listening. There's an old warning that gets passed around in half-jokes and low voices. If you hear a woman crying out on the bog, don't go near and don't answer her. You don't ask her what's wrong. You don't offer to walk her home, because she isn't crying for comfort, and she isn't lost in the way a person gets lost. And if she says a name, it's not a question, it's a message. O'Neill, O'Brien, Kane. A house somewhere will go quiet, whether you're there to hear it or not. The crying will find its way on its own. All you can do is keep your head down, keep walking, and thank whatever listens that she wasn't looking for your door. Tony and Ali arrived already out of breath. Kathleen Morris was halfway down the hall with her shawl half on, calling Patrick's name, her voice tight with the kind of strain that came from trying not to panic in front of other people. Patrick's boots thudded on the floor and then on the stairs, then towards the door again. "Oh, Tony," Kathleen said when she saw him. "Thank God, I'm so sorry to do this to you." "What's wrong?" Tony asked, closing the door behind him. "That's the mother," Patrick said, passing through the hall with his coat in his hand. "She's taken bad and we have to go now." The house was bright then. Lamps burned along the walls, throwing warm light up toward the ceiling. Tony noticed how high the ceiling was, how long the hall stretched away past the stairs. It wasn't the sort of house you took in at a glance. It felt like it kept parts of itself to one side. Kathleen was already moving again. "Listen, Jamie's asleep. His crib is upstairs on the second floor. You'll hear him if he wakes." That was it. That was all the instruction he got. Tony nodded. Of course. Look, you go on." She stopped in front of him just for a moment and put her hand on his arm. It wasn't dramatic, just a brief squeeze, as if to reassure herself as much as him. "Look, he'll be fine with you," she said, "in your family." Then they were gone. The doors shut, the sound of the horse and cart faded down the lane. The house, which had been full of movement only seconds earlier, fell into a silence that felt too deliberate to be comfortable. Tony stood where he was, listening. The quiet wasn't empty, it felt aware. He shook that thought off immediately. He didn't need to be spooking himself in someone else's house. He rolled his shoulders, took a breath, and looked around properly for the first time. This was their new place, his auntie and uncle. He had heard all about it, of course. Bigger, better. Patrick had done well for himself. Tony hadn't expected it to feel quite so sprawling. The hallway ran farther than it needed to. Doors branched off to either side, their shapes swallowed by distance. The staircase climbed, split at the landing, then disappeared again, as if the house didn't want to show all of itself at once. He hadn't been shown around. He didn't know where anything was beyond what Kathleen had said. Upstairs, second floor, that was all. He listened again. At first, there was nothing. Then, thin and sudden, a baby's cry cut through the house from above. Tony felt it in his chest before he registered it properly. It wasn't a mild waking cry. It was a sharp, frightened, and immediate cry. "It's all right," he said aloud, more to himself than anything else. "It's just the dark." Wall-mounted oil lamps ran along the hall and stairwell. One burned near the front door, another glowed halfway up the stairs. Tony struck a match and made sure the nearest lamp was properly lit before moving. The flame steadied behind the glass, ordinary and reassuring. He took the first step up the stairs, slowly, listening as he went. The crying continued, high and urgent, echoing oddly in the open space. He reached the landing and lit the next lamp, and as the flame caught, the lamp below him went out. Tony paused. He leaned over the banister and looked down. Darkness. That's strange, he muttered. Old house, he told himself, new fittings, bad oil, nothing more than that. The crying pulled him onward. He climbed higher, lighting another lamp, and then another, and each time he noticed the same thing out of the corner of his eye, the previous light dying as the new one took hold. But he didn't stop. The sound above was too sharp for hesitation. By the time he reached the second floor, his breathing had quickened without him realizing it. The crying was close now, very close. He followed it along the corridor, past doors he didn't open, until he reached the room at the end. A lamp was fixed to the wall beside the door. He struck a match, lit it, and paused at the open door. The room was lit. The crib stood where it should have been, but empty. Tony stared at it. His mind refused it at first. He took a step forward, leaned closer, as if the baby might simply be tucked out of sight. Nothing. Oh no, he said quietly. Then the crying came again. Not from the crib, not even from the room, but from somewhere else in the house. Lower, farther away. Tony backed out slowly, his heartbeat beginning to escalate like nothing he'd ever felt before. He lit the next lamp along the corridor. Behind him, the nursery lamp went out. His stomach twisted. He stood there, trying to listen properly, trying to work out where the sound was coming from. It seemed to come from the stairs, then from somewhere beyond them, as if it were slipping through the house rather than traveling through it. He moved, lighting lamps as he went, but every time he did, the light behind him vanished. The house refused to hold still in his head. Corridors seemed longer than before. Turns didn't lead where he expected them to. Okay, all right, just calm down, he said under his breath. This is something silly, we can just figure this out. The crying didn't stop. He reached the stairs again and lit the landing lamp. The second floor fell into darkness behind him, the blackness swallowing the corridor whole. The crying now came from below, louder and more desperate. Tony took the stairs quickly, one hand skimming the wall, and at the bottom he found himself back in the front hall. A lamp nearby gave just enough light to see the front door. Out, his mind told him. Get help. He grabbed the handle and pulled. It didn't move. He pulled harder. Something hit him square in the chest. It wasn't a stumble, it wasn't a loss of balance, it was a solid, deliberate shove that sent him backward into the wall hard enough to knock the breath out of him. The lamp went down. Tony gasped, panic finally breaking through his attempts at calm. The baby screamed. He struck a match in the dark. The flame flared, bright and fragile, and he took one step forward, and the flame was blown out instantly, sharp and close, like a breath against his fingers. Tony went frighteningly still. The space in front of him felt full, occupied. He backed away slowly, chest pounding so hard he could feel it in his throat. He tried again, another match, another step. Again, the flame was extinguished the moment he moved. Whatever was in the darkness wouldn't allow him to walk with light. His thoughts began to tangle. He couldn't tell where he was anymore, only that the crying kept shifting, always just ahead of him, always somewhere else. He found a candle in a drawer and tried to light that, his hands shaking now. The wick refused to catch, no matter how long he held the flame there. He tried again and again, until his fingers burned and he swore under his breath, throwing the candle aside. The crying went on, relentless, hoarse, scraping. He chased it because he didn't know what else to do. He lit wall lamps, watched them die behind him, burned through matches faster than he realized. The house seemed to stretch, to rearrange itself, to offer him corridors that led nowhere useful. Of course, it wasn't actually changing. It was only the fact that he'd never been there before. By the time he checked his pocket and found only one match left, his legs felt weak. He stood beneath the lamp bracket somewhere near the center of the house, listening to the baby cry somewhere beyond the dark, and something finally broke through the panic. What if young Jamie wasn't being moved, at least not after the initial time? What if Jamie was crawling toward the only thing that felt safe? Light. Every time Tony heard a new cry and ran toward it, he lit a new lamp, and the lamp Jamie had been crawling toward went out. He saw it then, horribly clear, the baby crawling toward warmth, toward the glow, only for it to vanish again and again, plunging the poor baby back into darkness, and something unseen enjoying every second of it. Tony's skin turned to ice at the thought of it, and so he lit the lamp with his very last match, his last chance. The flame caught. He stayed where he was. The crying continued. Every part of him screamed to run, to fix it, to do something. He didn't. Minutes passed, long minutes. The sound began to change. It stopped echoing through the house. It stopped sliding away from him. It grew close in a way that felt real. A small hand slid into the edge of the light, fingers trembling on the floorboards, and then a face, wet, red, and exhausted. Jamie crawled fully into the glow and collapsed. Tony dropped to his knees and gathered him up, holding him tight, his whole body shaking. And beyond the light, the darkness stayed where it was, quiet and satisfied. When Kathleen and Patrick returned, Tony said only the baby wouldn't settle. He never spoke of lamps. He never spoke of the match. And he never entered that house again. Some things don't want you to hurt. Some things don't want anything at all. Sometimes the dark is just curious. It watches the way panic makes people move too fast, the way fear turns good intentions into mistakes, the way a person can undo the very thing they're trying to save over and over again, simply by reacting instead of stopping. The darkness didn't need the child. It didn't need the house. It didn't need to follow rules or finish anything. It only needed the confusion, the running, the wrong choices made for the right reasons. And when the chaos finally settled, it was content to let the light win, because it had already gotten what it wanted. Do you have any regrets? Regrets? I do. I have regrets more than I ever admitted when it mattered. They don't arrive all at once, you know. They come one by one, quietly, like thoughts you brush aside during the day because you tell yourself there's time to deal with them later. That was always my mistake, believing later was something guaranteed. I regret how often I stayed quiet when speaking would have cost me very little and meant everything. I called it patience. I called it keeping the peace. I told myself I was being the bigger man, but the truth is, most of the time I was just afraid. Afraid of being disliked, afraid of standing alone, afraid of discovering that saying what I believed might change how people saw me. Silence just felt safer, but it wasn't. It just delayed the damage. Regrets. I regret confusing endurance with strength. I stayed in places that were shrinking me because I thought suffering through something made me noble. I thought if I could take a bit more, if I could just last a little bit longer, then surely it'd count for something in the end. Turns out, endurance only matters when you're enduring the right thing. Otherwise, it's just slow erosion. I regret how I was loyal to people who were quietly undoing me. I mistook familiarity for love, history for obligation. I kept giving chances because I didn't want to be the kind of man who gave up on people. What I didn't realize was that every chance I gave them was one I took away from myself. I regret how often I waited to feel ready, ready to change, ready to leave, ready to speak, ready to begin. I thought readiness would arrive like permission. Never did. All those years I thought I was preparing. I was really just postponing the discomfort of action. I regret believing that truth automatically wins. I truly believe that if I did the right thing long enough, if I kept my hands clean and my head down, the world would eventually notice. I didn't understand how often truth needs a voice and how rarely it survives on silence alone. I regret how I treated time as if it were generous. I wasted good mornings worrying about bad evenings. I wasted years thinking about how things used to be or how they might someday become, instead of noticing that the present was quietly becoming my entire life. I regret the way I spoke to myself. I was harsher with myself than I ever was with anyone else. I replayed mistakes until they became my identity. I punished myself long after the lesson was learned. I thought that self-criticism was accountability. It wasn't. It was cruelty dressed up as discipline. I regret the times I mistook comfort for happiness. There were moments I could have stepped into something uncertain, something honest, something alive, but I didn't. I chose what was familiar, what was predictable, what required the least explanation. I told myself I was being sensible. What I was really doing was choosing not to risk disappointment. I regret believing that being good would protect me. I thought decency was a kind of armor. I didn't realize it's only a compass. It tells you where to go, but it doesn't stop the world from hurting you if you just stay still. I regret how late I learned that most of the rules I lived by were never enforced by anyone but me. I carried them faithfully. I defended them. I suffered under them. And not once did I stop to ask who'd written them in the first place. I regret how often I thought tomorrow would be different without doing anything to make it so. And I regret that I'm only saying all this now when it no longer costs me anything, to be honest. But if there's one thing I wish I understood sooner, it's this. Your life doesn't collapse all at once. It gives way quietly, day by day, decision by decision, until one day you look around and realize you've been living with the consequences longer than you ever lived with the choices. I had chances, real chances, not perfect ones, not painless ones, but chances, all the same. I didn't take them. And now all I can do is see them clearly. And that's the hardest part. A grim bell tolled somewhere beyond the walls once, then again it was time. The door opened in his cell, iron on iron, and the priest stepped inside. Blonde rose from the bench at once, his only family, his only cousin. She took his hands and held them longer than she needed to, her fingers tightening as her eyes filled, despite herself. Look at me. We fought this as best we could, she said, her voice catching. You and me together, and you and me know the truth, even if they don't. He looked at her and smiled, a soft, kind smile, the same one he'd carried through his life, the same one he'd offered freely, even when it cost him. Whatever had been said about him, whatever the unjustly verdict, that smile had never left him. He released her hands and stepped forward. The priest fell in beside him. A guard took his arm. His wrists were bound, not tightly, just enough to make the point. They walked down the dark stone corridor, their footsteps hollow and slow. The bell continued to toll above them, each sound settling deeper than the last. At the end of the passage, the steps waited, and at the top, the rope hung ready to take from the world a beautiful heart it could never give back. Mind the deer with the crown of bone, mind the paths the old men shun, for when the stag is not alone, a greener hunter draws the sun. He does not run, he does not call, he walks you down through mist and briar, and antlers rise where hunters fall, when blood is taken without fire. The night before the hunt, the pub was warm and thick with talk. Smoke clung to the low ceiling and the windows rattled whenever a cart passed on the street outside. Men sat shoulder to shoulder, boots steaming by the hearth, pints left untouched as stories went back and forth like cards. Dinny McCormick sat near the end of the table, coat open, collar clean, his rifle case resting against the wall beside him. He said very little, he never had. The men around him filled the silence gladly. "Do you remember the business back in Clare?" said Pascal Cook, leaning back on his stool. "As the fog came in so thick you couldn't see your hand. 3 lads turned back, but Denny, he went in alone." A younger man shook his head. "I'm sure you can't track in that." "By Jesus you can, if you know how," Pascal said. "He found the beast by where the grass was bent, not broken. Knew its very weight by the depth of the print. Knew its age by how it favoured one side." Tinny smiled faintly, eyes on his glass, and Pascal went on. I've seen him cover his own tracks so clean it's where he floated. Stream beds, stone walls, walking backwards through heather. He doesn't hunt like the rest of us. He thinks ahead. He always has. Someone laughed. You'd nearly think he was being hunted himself. Denny looked up at that, amused. If I was, he said, I'd know it. The laughter rolled again, but at the bar an older man who hadn't joined in lifted his head. There's hills out west of here, the man said, voice low. Places where the ground doesn't forget. You'd want to mind yourself thereby. Denny met his gaze. I've paid for the land I'm going on. I've permission. The man nodded slowly. Permission? That isn't the same as welcome. Denny stood then, gathered his coat. I'm hunting at twilight tomorrow, he said. I'll be back before dark proper. No one answered that. The fire popped. The man at the bar looked back into his pint. The hills were open and bare, rolling away into the long grey lines beneath the sky already thinning toward evening. Mist lay in the folds of the land like breath trapped beneath bones. Here and there, old stone walls cut across the slopes, broken and half swallowed by grass. Denny left the cart where the track ended and went on foot. The air was cold enough to sting the lungs. He moved easily, rifle slung, eyes always lifting and lowering, taking in the ground ahead and the sky above it. The ruin stood out even from a distance, and rose ancient from a low hill, a square tower with half its walls collapsed, the rest standing stubborn and dark against the mist. A place built to hold, then to break. He noted it and filed it away, stone, height, cover. The sign came sooner than he expected. The grass lay pressed in a wide arc, not snapped or churned heavy. Further on, a boulder bore long pale scars where bark or hide had rubbed against it. High scars, higher than any living stag should reach. Denny crouched and touched the ground, cold, damp, fresh. A smile tugged at his mouth. He moved downslope, keeping the wind on his cheek. Twilight deepened, the hills losing their colour until everything was shades of grey and blue. The mist grew, blurring distance and swallowing sound. And then he saw the antlers. They rose above the mist like branches, wide and pale. For a moment he thought the animal stood still, and then it moved, slowly, and the shape of it became clear. This thing was enormous. Denny lowered himself and brought the rifle up. He didn't rush. He tracked the creature's movements, its weight, the way it favored one leg. He waited for the right angle. The mist curled. The antlers were gone. Denny eased forward. Careful now, he took 3 steps, then stopped. The hills had gone quiet. No birds, no wind in the grass. Even the sound of his own breathing felt too loud. A shape stood upslope, half seen through the mist. At first he thought it was another hunter, the way it was shaped. Then it moved. It was tall and faintly lit, as if the mist itself gave off a greenish glow around it. Antlers rose from its head, dark and branching, not worn like a crown, but grown there, part of its skull. This creature stood upright, broad shoulders, massive. It held a bow. Denny's heart pounded like the hammers of hell. He lifted the rifle and fired. The crack tore across the hills. The echo bounced off stone and died. The figure didn't fall. Dinny fired again. He saw the flash strike the mist, saw the recoil jolt the figure's chest, and still it came on, walking steadily. Dinny swore under his breath and backed away, then turned and ran. He ran not blindly, but toward the ruin, stone, walls, control. Behind him the mist parted. The figure dropped to all fours. It flowed forward with incredible speed, antlers slicing through the fog, body low and smooth, covering ground with terrifying ease. No sound of breath, no cry, just movement. Dinny reached the outer wall of the ruin and vaulted a fallen section, boots scraping the stone. He was inside the broken shell now, chest thumping, lungs burning. He stopped, listened. Footsteps. Not running, walking again. Dinny moved. Inside the ruin was a maze of collapsed rooms and narrow corridors. He ducked through an archway, climbed a half-fallen stair, then stopped and worked quickly. He pulled wire from his pouch and strung it low across the passage, anchoring it with loose stones. A noise trap, crude but effective. More a test of wit than practicality at this point. He retreated, circled, and took position behind a fallen pillar. The figure entered the ruin, its antlers brushed stone without a sound, bow drawn and ready at the hip. It reached the wire and paused. Dinny held his breath. The figure lowered one hand, tested the wire between his fingers, then stepped over it and left it exactly the way it had been. This didn't fare well for poor Dinny. He moved again, faster now. He dislodged stones at the top of a stairwell and waited. When the figure appeared below, Dinny kicked. The stones fell, striking the figure's shoulder and head, sending it back a step. For the first time, it reacted. It looked up. Dinny felt a savage thrill. He had hurt it, and he ran again. Mist sweeping into the ruin now, curling through doorways and stairwells, pooling along the floor. The hills were following him inside. An arrow struck the wall beside his head, burying itself into the very stone with a solid crack. Dinny ducked and rolled hard in his throat. Dinny was good, but not that good. Another arrow took him in the side, tearing through coat and flesh. He grunted, but kept moving, teeth clenched. He reached the great hall, roofless, open to the darkening sky. At the far end stood a massive stone mantle, blackened by centuries of smoke. Dinny scrambled behind it, blood warm at his ribs. He tore his shirt to strips and bound the wound quickly. His hands shook, but his mind stayed clear. Survive, escape. He climbed the remains of a stair and doubled back through a collapsed chamber, leaving false trails, disturbing the ground in places he hadn't walked. And then he waited again. The figure entered the hall. Mist curled around its legs, antlers framed against the open sky. It moved slowly, surveying the space. Dinny triggered another trap. A weighted beam swung down, striking the figure hard enough to stagger it. Again, that thrill, but the figure straightened, unhurt. It loosened an arrow without warning. It struck Dinny's thigh, pinning him to the floor. He screamed raw and sharp and tried to pull free. The pain was blinding. The figure approached, walking now, bow lowering. Dinny tore the arrow free with a shout and dragged himself upright, leaving blood on the stone. He staggered toward the mantle, climbing despite the pain. The figure followed. Another arrow flew. It pierced Dinny's shoulder and slammed him against the stone. Another took his other arm. He hung there now, spread wide, breath coming in wet gasps. The figure stepped close. A powerful thing, massively tall, snorting from its nostrils. Up close, Dinny could see that the green light wasn't light at all, but the color of damp moss and old leaves. The smell of earth rose from him. The bow lifted a final time. Dinny tried to speak. to curse, to plead. No words came that mattered. The final arrow took him straight through the chest. His body sagged, went still, pinned upright above the mantel like a prize taken from the hills. The rifle lay discarded below, already forgotten. The growing mist began to thin. The figure stepped back, satisfied, and twilight ended. They found nothing the next morning but a rifle leaning neatly against the outer wall of the ruin. There wasn't any tracks, no blood trail, no sign of a struggle. The old men said nothing. Among the hunters, there was a warning that isn't written down. Don't stray into the stag ground at twilight, because some hunts don't end with antlers on the wall. And sometimes the man who came for glory is the one that the land decides to keep. In the morning, when you wake, please like, subscribe, and leave a quiet comment. Tell me where you're listening from. Those small acts are what keep this place going. The soft echoes that allow the stories to return night after night. Come back every night and let this be your resting place. Good night.